Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about record speeds. It's a fascinating thing, actually, if you think about it. Um, and we, as collectors of early recordings, we don't often think about record speeds too much. We take it for granted that 78 is the speed of the old records. And there's an understanding reason for that. If you think about it, depending on what your age is, if you were around in the 1960s and early 70s and you saw stereo units or phonographs, the thing is that they would have three speeds: 33, 45, and 78. Now, it makes sense to think that 78 is the speed for those old records. And yes, it was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Mainly, they stayed at 78.26. There are exceptions, of course, to every rule. But mainly, they were pretty much on the spot for the speed. But if we look before that time, we really run into some serious issues when it comes to speed. I have had a saying I have used for a million years, and that is that 78 in the early days was a concept, much more so than a reality. Because through the history of the 78 record, as we call it today, there's been a myriad of different speeds used. And if we go back to the very beginnings with Berliner, we discover there's a situation that had to be rectified. And the situation was this: you had a conflict between speed and duration of the recording. And if you think about it, the faster you go on a disc record, the shorter the record is. And when we're talking about a 7-inch disc, which is what was put out by Berliner commercially, yes, there were some little 5-inch records put out in Europe beforehand, which were incredibly fast and lasted like, you know, 30 seconds and stuff like that. But let's go beyond that. Let's go to the commercial recordings put out by Berliner. And starting from the beginnings of the Berliner Company, there were issues. And they had to look at the process in which those records were made. And they were more or less engraved. And they were harsh and loud. But the slower you went, the more surface noise you would get. And if you went too slow, it would start sounding ridiculous. And if you went too fast, your record wouldn't last very long. So they had a compromise of sorts. And they kind of put it around 65 RPMs. Now, that was not a definite rule, but it was basically where they felt everything would be comfortable. And it was probably the best mix with duration and with speed. Now, were they all around 65? No. they were anywhere. They sometimes could be 60, they could be 70, sometimes they would switch while it was playing. It was very little consistency. The thing that I find very fascinating is the fact that with that speed, the recording engineer was God. And the recording engineers were busy. A lot of times they'd be making lots and lots and lots of recordings. And I gather, this is my guess, and I think it's probably pretty true, that many of them were quite sure of their sight in seeing a record move and its speed. And so they would sit there and say, that's about right. Give or take 65-ish. Sometimes it was a lot more issues than necessary, but it was usually right around there. I don't think they tested every time they did a recording. And that's why there's the inconsistency. And of course, through the period of the Berliner Grammophon, the records were more or less around 65 RPM, give or take an ish. Now, the copycats that came along, the universal talking machine, the Zonophone, which copied everything about Berliner, including their masters. I mean, so they already had the speed set up in those early records by the Zonophone because they were stolen. But eventually they went into their own market, and their records were right around 65 RPM too. Not all of them. Some of them were 70. Some were 72. As we move along and we get to Climax, the early Columbia discs, once again, we see we're all over the ballpark with those. They are slow. They are fast. I have found ones that are moving a little over 60 RPMs, and I found some that were close to 80. It's pretty amazing, the widespread. And as we get into the Victor period, the Columbia period, and the other early companies, you will see that myriad of different speeds. And so, as I said before, it was a concept. Yes, your records are 78, but they weren't. Recording engineers had their own ideas on what speed a certain singer should be. I mean, there were recording engineers who felt that Billy Murray sounded best around like 74 or 75 RPMs. That doesn't make much sense. And of course, that was not added to the description of the record. So they would play it at 78, and it wouldn't be an accurate representation of his singing. A lot of Caruso recordings are all over the map. His earliest records, made in Italy, some of them go as slow as 67 RPM, and some go about as fast as about 81 RPM. So there's a wide discrepancy. But a vast majority of the Victor recordings of Caruso, especially toward the latter part of his career, seem to end up around 75 to 76 RPMs. And so, of course, if you play him at 78, it's a slightly different sound. And of course, you have to find out which records was recorded at what speed, which is not always the case that you can find out. Now, with orchestral, with jazz bands and stuff like that, there are the spots, the music, and that makes a big difference. I'm sure many of you who will be watching this is aware of Gavin Rice, an amazing young man of incredible understanding of music, and also has perfect pitch, which is a blessing and a curse at the same time. But he, in conversation when we're talking, will mention that it's a half step too high, it's a half step too low, or this, that, and everything else. And you can hear it because he knows the music. And so it's kind of a fascinating thing to have a conversation with him as we talk about stuff like this. And you'll find as we get into the electrical era, things start to even out. Once you get electronics into the situation, you start getting somewhat of a sense of 78. And there still are moments when things aren't the same. With Edison, some cylinders are not doing 160. With the diamond discs, most of them were the correct speed, but there are moments when they were not. Columbia, Victor, all the various companies. And so it's a fascinating thing and something you should be aware of, always, to take a look and take a listen to your records. And don't just think that they're 78, because there's a doggone good chance they're not. So it's really quite fascinating, and I wanted to talk about this, and I thought it would be a good thing to share, especially with younger collectors or new collectors who have no understanding of the history yet. And maybe a lot of older collectors aren't aware of a lot of the history. But the thing is that 78 has been somewhat of a foggy issue in the sense of reality in the history of sound recording. that the 78 disc eventually would become 78, but it had a wide variance throughout its history before that time. That's about all I wanted to say. Just wanted to share a little stuff. And enjoy your collecting and enjoy your records and have some fun with the speeds.